that should be published by the time this goes out. And she runs an organic cotton clothing company.
I do indeed.
Boom and Jen. And the links for Jen's stuff are down there in the description box below this video as well. So, huge thank you then for coming on, Ian. And we're going to just go right back then to find out, why did you want to join the police?
That's a good question.
What was you like as a young person
that's
that
a really
influenced
good question.
that decision?
So you can probably tell I'm originally from Birmingham, although I try and hide it now, but I am. And I went to university from there. I was a goody-goody as a kid, didn't get in a lot of bother, but it was the time when things were, there's a lot of riot stuff going on, 1985, that time. And I'd gone from this sort of cotton wool upbringing to university, grew up a little bit, and then I was thinking about, well, what do you want to do? And I remember a lot of the forms at the time, they were always saying, well, what ethnicity are you? This, that, the other. And I was thinking, why are they so interested in my ethnicity? Anyway, I went on 3 different courses, familiarisation courses, to find what the police is like. And I was also mad on football at the time. And somebody said, you come to my force, you'll do well, young man, blah, blah, blah. And it was all about playing football then. So I joined, and my first 7 years were all about playing football. That was it. It was like being a pro. Oh, I wasn't good enough to be pro, but it was a bit like that. And then you get promoted and life gets a bit more serious. You with me? So that's how it went then. And I started in Staffordshire, in a place called Burton-on-Trent, which is a good place to learn. And fairly soon after I started, I did what everybody else did. You have to walk the beat. And when you walk the beat, it's very interesting. What you see on the first day is not the picture you see on the second year. That makes sense. It keeps changing. You see it in more detail as you understand more, your understanding grows, And 2.5 years later, I went on to the CID. And that was my career then. Most of the time I spent as a detective.
Yeah. Let's take turns. You just go and I'll go.
Oh, sorry.
That's using hand signals.
Just prodding you. Right. So running a team involved in a covert investigation of police corruption in 2012 to 2015. Talk me through it.
So that was towards the end of my career.
We don't want to go there, do we? We'll start at the beginning.
The training. Let's go with the training.
Yes.
Yeah. What was the training like?
Right. The training was interesting. It was, it might be, this is training as a PC or as a detective.
So when you first went in, what were you confronted with?
Right. So I remember I was at headquarters, and my first day starting, the Handsworth riots were on, right? And I remember I was sitting at the back of a room, the only black guy there, and not everybody, but people were making these comments about what was going on as they watched these riots going on the TV. And I actually did think at that point, what have I joined? Right? I did think that at the time.
Oh dear.
But when I went back to my area, it was a very different, very supportive structure. I mean, in those days, people used to take the mick a lot. They didn't just take the mick out of men, black men. They took the mick out of women, anybody who was different, because it was that type of culture. But that has changed vastly since during the course of my career. It is not what it is like now. Now, you wouldn't think that because of the way people talk about it, but it's not like that now. People are afraid. If they think it, they don't necessarily say it.
So what is it like now?
It's a lot more PC. It's more PC than most, I would say, most work environments, But again, if you look at the media and you'll see what they're saying about men in the police now currently, there's this idea that you can't trust anybody if somebody stops you on the street, etc., etc. I think that's a massive exaggeration. Most police officers aren't like that.
What was your parents' attitude towards joining the police?
My parents are very supportive. They came over in the 50s from Jamaica, and they're very much sort of deferent towards this country. You've got to be twice as good. You've got to work hard, all this sort of stuff. So I actually think that in my years, right, and this, coming on to stress and stuff, sometimes I thought I was half as good because they're telling me I had to be twice, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because of just the way you come to think. And But yeah, they were really supportive of what I did. Not all the family were like that, however, and you kind of had to be. This is where you kind of had to be kind of thick-skinned, because a lot of people are saying you're a sellout, you're a this, you're a that.
Wow.
I don't know how old you are, Sean, but if you understand that mentality was very much. It's not a big deal
52.
now. But yeah, well, you'll get it then.
Yeah.
You don't look it either.
How old are
thank
you?
I'm 58 now.
No way! I was thinking late 40s.
No, 58.
Good grief.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But like I said, I didn't look like this when I came out, but we'll talk about that later on.
Good skin care regime.
Yeah.
You said that some family members took exception then.
Yeah.
How did you handle those situations?
You try and reason with them, but they're so impacted by what they believe, that makes sense, and they're sort of collecting all the negative, and there was a lot of negative information around about that time about the police service, and there was a lot of bad practice that went on at that time.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, there was. I mean, they talk about stop and search, and I think some of that was because a lot of people didn't understand. A lot of guys I joined with, they never really met black people before, so they would tend to think in the negative about them because they'd never met any before. Does that make sense? And I think that stop and search and stuff did reflect that then. I think that people generally now are more understanding and understand more about communities. I think you're going to really struggle, particularly as a senior officer, if you don't have an understanding of communities now. But again, I just don't think that change is reflected in people when they're talking about the service. They're talking about what used to happen rather than what's happened now. They've tried to do a lot to change things. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's not like it was.
Yeah.
Having said that, I left 6 years ago now. But
What was the first hazardous situation you got into?
Right, you mean with somebody else, or where I put myself at risk?
Were you was at risk one way or the other?
Okay.
Yeah, something that challenged you physically, mentally, and
Yeah. So in those days, the way they managed conflict wasn't like it is now, right? It was sort of more. You turn up to a scene, there's a pub fight, and everybody just wades in. It wasn't. Honestly, it was. There's no technical sort of aspect of it. Whereas now, they've got really good ways of managing conflict, etc. So, those days people were drinking a lot more, particularly in that town, and so they would get a lot more violent. I think probably a lot more violent than now, in fact. And a lot of the time, when you're going to go and arrest, people who are well known, you don't tend to have a lot of hassle with them. They usually, you talk to them and they come. But when you go to scenes where people are under the influence of alcohol or other stuff, that's where you tend to get violent. So there were times when, you go in and you've got to use your size or whatever else to deal with difficult things. But it wasn't most of the time. And there was a couple of times when I'd been out on my own on patrol, and I'd seen things and then had to react to them. But most of the time, I think people were usually quite compliant. Maybe that was because of the way I communicate with people, because they weren't always compliant. Some people some people got a harder time than me.
What were the riots like? Because I actually know someone who used to be part of the Met riot police.
What? I didn't actually, I'm just trying to think. I've been on riot training, but because I was a detective, I didn't have to go to a lot of that stuff, because it was usually people who were doing the uniform public order stuff. Right. As a detective, you always go up and pick up the pieces afterwards. You with me? Which isn't always easy. But yeah, it was in 85 when I joined, it was kind of what the hell's going on. But then once you start to get used to the fact that they're having riots, because that wasn't the only time, you tend to find that it's just one of those things that happens, But yeah, I was a PSU supervisor, so I had to go and do the training at times, but I never had to go to a riot. And but I've been to demonstrations and done stuff, but never to a riot.
Can you take us through the training? Do you have to get sprayed and things like that?
Yeah, the trainings, it's quite physical. You've got to wear all this hot gear that's fireproof, and as a detective, you're good at talking to people. Well, that's how it was then. And I'm more getting people on side and stuff like that. Whereas in that scenario, you have to change the way you manage. You've got to be more you over there now. Does that make sense? And it was a lot of yelling, a lot of shouting, a lot of fire, a lot of stuff where you're thinking, is this really what people have to go through? And they do, so it's not, you wouldn't necessarily choose to do it, but you're in the service, you have to do it, So yeah, that was it like.
Sorry.
Your turn.
Sorry, I haven't got my sheet. You stole it off me a minute ago.
You don't need it, just go off what it says.
God, you didn't prepare me now. You go.
Okay.
No.
All right. Did they have to spray you then with the, riot training in America? I think they do the spray and you've got to be sprayed. Did that happen to you?
Didn't spray. I mean, the thing that gets you is there's a lot of hazard around you. I mean, apart from the bricks flying over and the shields and things hitting you.
What, you get bricks chucked at you?
Yeah, they throw stuff at you. I can't if wooden blocks or bricks. I can't remember now. But it's like a really hazardous kind of environment. And then you'll have horses going, so you've got to be watching the horses.
Where is this held? Sorry, where is this held?
So they held it as, I think it was held at an old army camp,
right,
in Oxfordshire somewhere. That's where we went. And then sometimes you work with other forces to do the same kind of stuff. So there's a lot involved in it.
So you have to play both sides then. 1 minute you like a cop,
fireman,
arresting the rioters. The next minute you're a rioter.
Yeah.
Which one did you prefer?
It was usually the instructors that were there doing that. But then you had to go and arrest people. And look, it's a memory thing for me. But there's all these tactics about how you take people out and this, that, the other. So it's quite. But it wasn't my favourite stuff, to be honest. But I had to do it.
So all the other cops have interviewed then, quite quickly, they've encountered corpses in various situations. What was it like for you encountering your first corpse?
Oh.
I'm trying to think when the first one was, but most cops in my day, I'm not sure what happens now, had to go to a post-mortem, right? And
see it on the slab first.
Absolutely right. But you had to watch the post-mortem. That makes sense. Because sometimes you're having to provide the evidential chain from the scene to the post-mortem, to taking away the samples and stuff like that. So I don't want to get too gory, right?
Go for it.
But when they have to open the cranium, you'll hear that saw, cracking the skull and stuff like that, and it's got a particular type of odor. That some people find really, really tough. Some people can't go in, blah, blah, blah. But that's what you have to do. Now, the interesting thing is that, throughout, you're not doing it every week, but maybe 4 or 5 times in your career, you'll have to go. But after a while, it gets normal. Does that make sense?
The smell,
it just gets normal. And this is where I'm saying about the way the human psyche works. The first day you go to a scene, right? Everybody, oh, that's terrible, that's awful, blah, blah, blah. The next day, the body's in situ and people are having a cup of tea. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but they've got used to the fact that we're now in the midst of an investigation, we've got to do a job. And they're not thinking about how bad it was. Does that make sense? So it's almost like your mind is capable of changing the way you see situations. Right, but you don't always know that because you don't realize that your mind is giving yourself a hard time at the time. Does that make sense? So when people talk about those things, my memories aren't necessarily about the blood and gore because they're very faint now. It's like I've processed them, so I can hardly see them anymore. One that I remember, I did remember for a while until I did my training, was one where I went to a house and it was, this is DS stuff for you. You've got to go there because they're not sure why somebody's passed away. And a lot of time when you go, there's no suspicious circumstances, and there wasn't in this case. However, the guy had died in front of a fire, and he'd been there for like 2 weeks. And so when he's just sitting in the chair like this, and he's really bloated, you know, and that's the sort of thing you have to. People don't realise. You see all the glamour stuff on TV, and you think, oh well, you know, they go around in a suit and this, that, the other, but there's all that side of it, I think, that people don't really realise happens.
The grim and the gory.
And yeah, and as I say, there's no suspicious circumstances.
So at the end of a shift like that, then when you've encountered a bloated corpse,
how do you sleep at night?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and that's the point. You don't always retain it. The things you retain are not always like that. I'll tell you one that I did. I didn't retain it, but I'll tell you one that was more interesting. So there was a guy who was quite a big guy. And he's one of these guys who's gone through life and misfortune, etc., wasn't looking after himself, lived in his parents' house. Mum had passed away, wasn't paying the bills. You get what I'm saying? And then one day decided enough was enough, right? And so they called us to that, and he'd basically put a rope up through the ceiling and into the loft, right? And then basically, as the hatch had come down, the knot had dropped, and then he'd stood on a chair, and he'd stood on a chair and dropped, and then hung himself. So we got there. The house was absolutely freezing, and there was me as the DS, and there was a scenes of crime officer, and we're going there to see if there's any foul circumstances, and So I was the guy in charge. So they said to me, we need to go and look at the knot. We can't get the knot out of the loft. So they're trying to get this knot, and as they're getting the knot off, he's still hanging there. We can't really do anything until we get the knot.
Do you try and hold him up a bit? Or?
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? He was a big guy though, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, well, just get a broom and knock the loft, right? Knock the loft hatch. And so they started knocking this loft hatch. And the next minute, the rope came down and he went,
No!
That is horror film material. That is awful.
Oh my goodness.
You fell right. Guess what I did? I ran out. I've never seen a dead man come back to life.
I hear a lot that, obviously they pass a lot of wind and stuff. Does a lot of water come out?
Yeah, he wasn't alive. But because you just don't expect to hear a gasp.
No.
So you just straight out of Stephen King, that, isn't it?
Drop and roll.
Yeah. That's what I don't share too often, but yeah, it's true.
Was that the situation that frightened you the most out of your entire career, or was there something even worse that you made you jump?
You know what? I think the thing that probably frightened me the most, once this is in uniform, and it's like 3:00 in the morning. We get to a building, and somebody says, "Oh, somebody may have broken into the building," and I was like this, right, in the passenger seat. And they used to call me Smurf. I said, Smurf, go and have a look on the roof.
Hi, Smurf?
Ian Smith, Washington Smith, yeah. So I jumped out the car, climbed on the roof. The next minute, I fell through.
No.
Fell through. And I took the whole roof in with me. And I fell into a wood yard, and it caught my back, And then I was thinking afterwards, like you think, oh, how bad's this going to be? This, that, the other, you know. And it's my fault. I didn't think. You just don't think, Anyway, I was supposed to be 2% disabled following it, but whether I am or not, I don't know, because I don't really feel it now.
Right.
But that was probably the most frightening time I had.
Wow.
Yeah. How long were you left there for?
I was probably off for about 5 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was probably off for about 5 weeks. It wasn't as bad as I initially thought.
Right.
So what were the biggest challenges psychologically during the early years of your 30-year career?
Now I understand them. Now I understand more about how the mind works. It was more stress stuff. It was more, but people always talk in the service about stress being about the things that you go and see. And I mean, we'll talk afterwards more about how I understand that now. But it was more about let's say it like this: when I went from Staffordshire, it was all burglaries and robberies and this, that, the other, that type of crime. And then I went to work in Slough. I moved to Thames Valley, and that's my connection with Windsor and around there. And I was a DS there, and it was a totally different environment there. There was a lot of shootings, a lot of this, a lot of that. I'm not saying that people were getting shot.
Wow, yeah, I've done a few talks in Slough.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Slough is like older shot of that area.
There was a lot of
older
stuff
shot
going
of
on.
that area.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it stops at Windsor.
Yeah. I was going to say, I live the other side.
We don't do it out there, just in Slough. Yeah.
Stops at the Queen's Garden.
Yeah. Very strange that. Yeah. So in those days, it was more, he's a good lad. He can manage it, this, that, the other. We'll put him in the chair. There wasn't so much of the selection process that there is now. And obviously I'd been a DC before as well. So I sat down there to this new environment of threats to life where you had no training to manage threats to life. And I was going home thinking, will that person be okay? Will that family be okay? Blah, blah, blah. And the tactics you use, there's only so many tactics you can use. You with me? So there is an element of risk that you kind of have to manage, or so that was for me. That was the bit. It was like, what if something happens? What if? Until you learn that there's only so much you can do, and they talk about this stuff. Your policy, the way you explain your actions is actually what protects you, and you have to realize that, and that's how you manage risk.
Wow.
But for people who don't learn that, it's a very stressful thing to have to do, if you get what I'm saying. It's very stressful, but you kind of have to learn how you manage risk.
So you must have had your fun moments. I heard a story of someone once who worked for the Met, and he was in the riot police, but then he went over to being on the Thames,
yes,
the boat patrol, whatever it is.
Best job you can get.
It
Not
is.
one that I
used
had.
to pick up his daughters on the side of the Thames and take them home after a night out. But anyway, he would tell me a story about how obviously they're fishing out all the corpses out of the Thames from time to time from suicides. Lovely. And they would hook it up, and they got banned from doing that because the autopsy kept coming back that they couldn't determine the death because of the hook going in. But the best thing was, well, not the best thing, but the most interesting, slightly amusing story I heard is when they put a corpse on a deck chair and sailed it down the Thames with a pair of shades on, and they got in absolute trouble for that. Did you have any fun moments like that?
No, not quite like that.
They did get in a lot of trouble,
Not quite.
apparently.
I bet they did, and they definitely would now. I bet that's a long time ago now.
Yeah.
I bet it's a long time ago now. I'm trying to think fun moments. I mean, there were a lot of jokers when I started. You with me? There were a lot of characters. I don't know if it really attracts those types of people now. And a lot of them were guys who were plumbers or whatever who turned their hand to whatever, and they made really good cops. But now it's kind of, you have to have a degree to go in, so it's attracting a different type of clientele. That's what I'd say.
So in Slough then, gun crime, it's that's an escalation of the other crimes you've described. When you investigate like a gun crime, then what unique challenges does that present? And you come after, you're in the aftermath, aren't you? You're not chase. Are you then chasing the bad guys once you've got the information? You're going out.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really work. Like,
how does it work?
It's all now like completely safe. You with me? So for me to be unarmed and come across somebody who is armed, you'd have to be quite unlucky. I would say you'd have to be quite unlucky, because once you get that information, you call in a firearms team, and everything is assessed on the intelligence you have, so that you make sure that when you go through the door, you've got the right people with you to make sure that it's done quite safely. And to be honest, it is done safely. Most of the time it is. And there aren't that many people in the UK compared to the States that get shot, because they're very good at what they do. And they've got good operational means of managing those types of things. So yeah, so you do get. It is a bit strange though when you the way people's attitudes to guns is. I remember one time I went to a young Asian guy got shot, and I went to see him in hospital, and we were trying to find some of the witnesses. And one of his friends was another Muslim guy, young Muslim guy. So I said to him, I said, "Where are we going to find him on a Friday?" And he says, "What time is it?" And I told him the time, and he says, "He'll be at the mosque." And you'd never think, in the way we're brought up, so to speak, that you'd get somebody like that who was going to the mosque as well, But different communities think differently,
Okay.
Mm.
And what are people getting shot over in Slough? Is it drug gangs?
Then it was all about drugs, all about drugs and crime, and people falling out of, mostly drugs, to be honest.
What was the most popular drug in Slough?
I'm going to guess it's weed and coke.
Weed and coke, I would say.
They're consistently at the top, aren't they?
Weed and coke. I'll be honest with you, a lot of the time, particularly towards the end, it became sort of a regional thing. It was like it was the people that were really making the big money that they were going after. So a lot of the little things that were happening on the street, they weren't really focusing on those as much,
What about county lines?
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
What was Slough, Hampshire?
They're all over the place, aren't they? They're all over the place, yeah.
Is it Hampshire?
I presume so. It's not Surrey.
No. Slough's Berkshire.
Berkshire. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you explain to the viewers then what the problem is of county lines, what it means?
Yeah. When I started, it's just people taking advantage of other people's vulnerability, And when I started, there were other communities that were doing it. There were people pimping young girls and this, that, the other. And I think it went through a period where there was a lot of that, and you'll see that with all this stuff with social services and young kids being taken advantage of.
Not just.
They call it different things, but they call it. But there was other communities doing it when I first started.
Timestamp all that. Okay.
There was other communities doing it when I first started. But then it sort of moved where they're now taking over vulnerable people's houses out of town in order to set up drug dealing and this, that, the other. And it became quite a problem. As I said, 5 years ago, it seems now they seem to be getting a grip of it because it was like the number one priority. But once upon a time, it was a real problem.
So could you just explain to the viewers how County Lines is set up then? You said they take advantage of these vulnerable young people. What do they make them do? Have you got any examples from your career?
Not really from mine, no.
Okay.
Not really from mine, but from what I understand of it, they'll take over the premises that they're in. They can then set up there, and from their trade, because obviously the premises that vulnerable person isn't usually known by the police, so they kind of got free range to start the business from there, and then they start dealing from there. That's how I understand it.
So they're like fall guys.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They are clamping down on it though, I've noticed.
Yeah,
This day and age,
it's been a big priority, a real priority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been a real priority.
So what do you think then about like these cops who are part of LEAP, who're saying that drug laws are creating the drug problem by making it illegal, and you create this black market and all the criminality around it? If the government just took it over, people would know they were getting safe substances, kids could be sequestered from it and educated about it, and there wouldn't be all these backstreet drug deals. What worry you with all that stuff? I got more Scouse when I'm talking to Darren, and more Widnesian when I'm talking to. So I'm a Woolley back now.
Yeah, my view would have been once upon a time that it wouldn't help, sort of, changing the way they manage it. But my view now is probably they've got to do something different, and other countries that, like Holland, that are trying to manage it differently are having different results.
What do you think of California then at the moment?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know exactly what's going on there, but I know that their attitude towards it is now more liberal than it was, and they're trying to test in places, and
they've got lower crime rates. And
exactly. So I think we've got to ask the question: why aren't they willing to consider doing things slightly differently? That makes sense, because we don't seem to be succeeding now, and there are a lot of people suffering